a small, unassuming diner tucked away on the outskirts of a quiet town, life moved at its own unhurried pace. The air carried the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the sizzle of bacon on the grill. Patrons chatted idly, their voices blending into a comforting hum that filled the cozy space. Among them sat a woman who seemed to fade into the background, a figure so ordinary that no one paid her much attention. She wore a plain gray cardigan over a modest blouse, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her face bore no trace of makeup, and her hands were weathered but gentle as they turned the pages of a stack of papers spread across the table. A steaming cup of coffee rested beside her, untouched for several minutes as she scribbled notes in the margins of the documents. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another traveler passing through, perhaps taking a break during a long journey, or stealing a few moments of peace amid a busy day. But there was something about her presence, something subtle yet compelling, that hinted at more beneath the surface. Despite her simplicity, she carried an air of quiet confidence, the kind that comes not from arrogance but from knowing exactly who you are and where you stand. Yet, to the casual observer, she blended seamlessly into the crowd, unnoticed and unremarked upon. The tranquility of the diner was abruptly shattered when the door swung open with a loud creak. Two men strode in, their polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. They were dressed sharply in tailored suits, their ties slightly loosened as if they had come straight from a meeting. Their laughter echoed loudly, drawing the attention of everyone inside. One of them slapped the other on the back, his voice booming as he recounted some anecdote about a deal gone right, or wrong, it was hard to tell. Whatever it was, it left both men guffawing like schoolboys. They plopped down at a nearby booth, their energy infectious, at least to those who didn't mind the disruption. As they settled in, one of them gestured to the waitress, snapping his fingers impatiently despite the "Please wait to be seated" sign prominently displayed near the entrance. His companion leaned back in his seat, scanning the room with an air of entitlement. His gaze eventually landed on the woman sitting quietly by herself, hunched over her papers. "Well, well," he said, raising his voice enough to ensure half the diner could hear him. "Look at this. What do we have here? A librarian?" His tone dripped with mockery, and his friend chuckled, leaning forward to get a better look. The woman didn't react. She continued writing, her pen moving steadily across the page. If she heard the comment, she gave no indication. But the man wasn't done. Emboldened by his friend's amusement, he pressed further. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice louder now. "You're hogging all the tables. Shouldn't you be at home knitting sweaters or whatever it is people like you do?" He laughed again, slapping the table for emphasis. His words drew a mixture of reactions from the other patrons. Some shifted, uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Others exchanged glances, silently debating whether to say something. A few even smirked, either amused by the spectacle or relieved that the insult wasn't directed at them. The woman finally looked up, though only briefly. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, as though she were observing a curious phenomenon rather than enduring personal ridicule. She met the man's gaze for a split second before returning her focus to her work. This lack of response only fueled his bravado. "Oh, come on," he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in exaggerated frustration. "No comeback? No witty remark? I thought you intellectuals were supposed to be clever." He turned to his friend, feigning disappointment. "Guess we got a dud." His companion joined in, leaning toward the woman's table with a smug grin. "Yeah, seriously, what are you even reading? Some boring legal stuff, or maybe it's a recipe book? Either way, it looks like you're trying way too hard." Their laughter rang out once more, filling the diner with an uncomfortable tension. The waitress hovered nervously nearby, unsure whether to intervene. Other customers pretended to focus on their meals, though their body language betrayed their unease. It was clear that the two men thrived on attention, feeding off the discomfort they caused. Yet throughout it all, the woman remained unfazed. She methodically folded her papers, stacking them neatly before slipping them into a leather satchel. There was a deliberate grace to her movements, as if every action was calculated and purposeful. When she finally spoke, Her voice was soft, but firm, cutting through the noise like a knife. "I suppose," she began, her tone measured and calm, "that assumptions often reveal more about the person making them than the person they're aimed at." Her words hung in the air, silencing the room instantly. For a moment the two men stared at her, caught off guard by her composure. Then, one of them scoffed, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Assumptions? Oh, please. Like you're in any position to lecture us." He smirked, clearly convinced that he had the upper hand. But the woman simply smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips, and reached into her bag. What happened next would leave everyone in the diner reeling, forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the quiet stranger in their midst. The two men, emboldened by the laughter and attention they were receiving from their own antics, seemed to forget where they were, or perhaps they simply didn't care. They continued their barrage of insults, each comment more cutting than the last. Their voices grew louder, echoing off the diner's walls as if they owned the place. The quieter man, who had initially hung back and let his companion take the lead, now leaned forward with a smirk, eager to join in on what he clearly saw as harmless fun. "Seriously, though," he chimed in, his tone dripping with condescension, "what kind of job do you think someone like her could possibly have? She doesn't exactly scream success, does she?" He gestured toward the woman with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if she were some abstract concept rather than a living, breathing person sitting just a few feet away. His friend snorted in agreement, leaning back in his seat as though delivering the punchline to a joke only they understood. "You know what it is?" the first man said, raising an eyebrow theatrically. "She's probably one of those people who spends all day complaining about how hard life is. You know, the type who blames everyone else for their problems." He punctuated his sentence with a sharp laugh, slapping his knee for added effect. "Bet she's never accomplished anything in her entire life." Their words were sharp, designed, not just to mock but to belittle, to strip away whatever dignity the woman might possess. And yet, despite their efforts, she remained utterly composed. Her hands moved steadily, folding her papers with precision and slipping them into her bag, without so much as a glance in their direction. It was as if she existed in a different world entirely, untouched by their venom. The contrast between her calm demeanor and their escalating aggression began to unsettle the other patrons. A middle-aged couple seated nearby exchanged worried glances, their unease palpable. The husband opened his mouth as if to say something, but his wife quickly placed a hand on his arm, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. Across the room, a young man scrolling through his phone paused mid-scroll, his brow furrowing as he listened to the exchange. Even the waitress, who had been hovering nervously near the counter, hesitated before retreating to the safety of the kitchen. But the two businessmen were oblivious to the growing tension around them. They fed off each other's energy, their insults becoming increasingly ridiculous and increasingly cruel. One of them leaned across the table, squinting at the woman as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Wait a second," he said, snapping his fingers dramatically. "I've got it. She's definitely one of those people who thinks they're smarter than everyone else. You know, the ones who carry around books just to look important." His friend burst out laughing, nearly spilling, his soda in the process. "Oh yeah, totally. Probably reads those big-worded novels no one understands. Thinks she's some intellectual or something." He mimicked holding a book, squinting exaggeratedly as if struggling to read tiny print. "Look at me, I'm so smart," he crowed in a high-pitched voice, earning another round of chuckles from himself and his companion. The woman finally paused in her task, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her satchel. For a brief moment she looked directly at the men, her expression unreadable. There was no anger in her gaze, no sign of hurt or embarrassment. Instead, there was something else, something that made the two men falter ever so slightly, though neither could explain why. Then just as quickly, she returned her attention to her bag, zipping it closed with a soft click. Encouraged by her silence, the first man pressed on, his bravado returning in full force. "Come on, lady," he taunted, leaning back in his chair, with a smug grin. "Don't tell me you're too good to talk to us, or maybe you're just scared we'll outsmart you." He glanced at his friend, winking conspiratorially. Not that that would be hard. The second man nodded enthusiastically, clearly enjoying himself. Yeah, seriously. What's your deal? Are you some kind of shut-in who doesn't know how to interact with real people? Or are you just plain rude? Their words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the rest of the diner fell silent. Even the clatter of dishes from the kitchen seemed to fade into the background. Every eye in the room was fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The two brash, overconfident men versus the quiet, unassuming woman who refused to rise to their bait. For a moment it felt as though time itself had slowed down. The atmosphere was charged, electric, as if everyone collectively held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would the woman finally snap? Would she lash out in anger, proving the men right in their assumptions? Or would she continue to sit there, silently absorbing their cruelty? Instead, she did something unexpected. With deliberate slowness, she reached into her bag once more, this time pulling out a small leather wallet. Opening it, she revealed a badge, a gleaming emblem of authority that caught the light and sent a ripple of shock through the room. The two men froze, their smirks vanishing instantly as realization dawned on their faces. What followed was a moment of pure, unadulterated disbelief. The woman's calm voice cut through the stunned silence like a knife. "Justice Evelyn Carter," she said simply, her tone carrying the weight of someone accustomed to command. "Supreme Court Judge, perhaps you've heard of me?" The transformation in the room was immediate. Gasps erupted from the other patrons, some covering their mouths in astonishment while others stared wide-eyed at the badge. The two men, meanwhile, turned pale, their earlier bravado crumbling under the crushing weight of their own arrogance. In that instant, they realized they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and that the consequences of their actions might be far greater than they had ever imagined. The diner seemed to freeze in that moment, the air thick with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Justice Evelyn Carter's words hung suspended, resonating like a gavel striking its block. Her voice was calm but firm, each syllable carrying the weight of authority she had spent decades earning. She didn't shout or raise her tone. Instead, her measured delivery only amplified the impact of her revelation. The badge in her hand gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, its golden emblem unmistakable, an insignia that symbolized one of the highest positions of power in the country. For the two businessmen, time appeared to slow down. Their smirks vanished instantly, replaced by expressions of sheer panic as their minds raced to process what they had just heard. One of them opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, unable to form words. His companion, who moments ago had been laughing loudly at his own jokes, now sat rigid, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly on the table. They exchanged a glance, their earlier bravado crumbling into dust as the gravity of their situation dawned on them. Around the room, other patrons reacted with equal astonishment. A young mother clutching her coffee cup gasped audibly, nearly spilling her drink. An elderly man at the counter removed his glasses, blinking rapidly as though trying to confirm he wasn't hallucinating. Even the waitress, who had retreated to the kitchen during the height of the confrontation, peeked out cautiously, her eyes wide with amazement. Whispers began to ripple through the diner, soft at first but growing louder as people pieced together the implications of what they were witnessing. "Well," Justice Carter said after a brief pause, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She slipped the badge back into her wallet and placed it gently inside her bag, as if handling something precious yet ordinary. "I suppose introductions are in order." She glanced toward the two men, her expression unreadable, neither angry nor amused but simply observant, as if studying an interesting case before rendering judgment. The first businessman, still struggling to find his footing, stammered awkwardly. Judge Carter? I mean..." He trailed off, his confidence evaporating completely. His friend, equally flustered, leaned forward hesitantly, attempting to salvage the situation. "Ma'am, we didn't know. Honest. If we'd known who you were..." His voice faltered, trailing into silence as he realized how hollow his Words sounded. Justice Carter raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, her gaze piercing yet not unkind. "If you'd known who I was," she repeated softly, letting the sentence hang in the air. She folded her hands neatly on the table, her posture relaxed but commanding. "And what difference would that have made? Would your behavior change? Based solely on my title?" Her question struck a nerve, not just with the two men but with everyone listening. It was a simple query, yet it carried profound weight, forcing those present to reflect on their own actions and biases. The two businessmen exchanged another uneasy glance, neither willing to answer. Instead, they shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier arrogance replaced by shame and regret. Sensing the tension in the room, Justice Carter allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Let me tell you something," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Titles don't define us. Respect should be extended to every individual, regardless of their station in life. You assumed I was insignificant because of how I looked or dressed. But isn't it possible that someone who appears ordinary might still hold value or even power that you couldn't see?" Her words landed like ripples in a pond, spreading outward and touching everyone within earshot. Some nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson she was imparting. Others looked away, perhaps reminded of times when they too had judged others unfairly. The two businessmen, however, seemed paralyzed, unable to meet her steady gaze. One of them finally found his voice, though it came out weak and tremulous. "We're sorry, Your Honor, truly. We didn't mean any disrespect." He swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. It was just a joke. We didn't realize." Justice Carter held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Intent matters less than impact," she said quietly. "Your words may have been intended as humor, but they caused harm nonetheless. And while apologies are important, they must also be accompanied by a willingness to learn and grow." She paused, allowing her words to sink in fully. Then, leaning back slightly in her chair, she added, "Consider this a learning opportunity. Perhaps next time you'll think twice before assuming the worst about someone simply because they don't fit your expectations." The room remained silent, the weight of her speech settling over everyone like a blanket. The two businessmen sat motionless, their faces flushed with embarrassment. For all their posturing earlier, they now looked like chastised children, humbled by the realization of their mistakes. Other customers watched intently, some nodding in agreement, others visibly moved by the scene unfolding before them. Justice Carter stood up then, smoothing her cardigan as she did so. She slung her satchel over her shoulder and turned toward the exit, pausing briefly to address the waitress who stood frozen near the counter. "Thank you for the coffee," she said warmly, handing her a few bills. "Keep the change." As she walked out of the diner, the door swinging shut behind her, the room erupted into quiet conversation. People whispered excitedly about what had just transpired, marveling at the unexpected twist of events. The two businessmen remained rooted to their seats, staring blankly ahead, as if trying to comprehend how quickly their world had turned upside down. Outside, Justice Carter stepped into the crisp afternoon air, her pace unhurried as she made her way to her car. To anyone watching, she appeared no different than when she had entered the diner, an unassuming figure blending seamlessly into the crowd. Yet inside, she carried the knowledge that sometimes the simplest acts of dignity and grace could leave the most lasting impressions. As Justice Evelyn Carter stepped out of the diner and into the cool afternoon air, the world outside seemed blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded within those walls. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Birds chirped lazily from nearby trees, and the distant hum of traffic provided a soothing backdrop to the quiet moment. For anyone passing by, she was just another person leaving a meal. Nothing remarkable, nothing extraordinary. But inside the diner, the atmosphere remained charged. Conversations buzzed like static electricity, each table dissecting what had happened with varying degrees of awe and disbelief. Some patrons replayed the scene in their minds, marveling at how quickly the tide had turned against the two arrogant businessmen. Others whispered about Justice Carter herself, speculating on her life, her work, and the kind of person who could remain so composed under such provocation. Back at their booth, the two men sat frozen, unable to move or speak. Their earlier bravado felt like a distant memory replaced now by a crushing weight of shame. One of them buried his face in his hands, muttering under his breath, "I can't believe this is happening." His companion stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly as if trying to hold himself together. Neither dared to look at the other, let alone the rest of the diner's occupants. The waitress approached cautiously, holding their check in one hand. She hesitated for a moment before placing it on the table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there anything else you need?" It wasn't really a question, it was more of an olive branch, a way to acknowledge their humanity. Despite their earlier behavior, one of the men nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact. "No, thank you," he mumbled, reaching for his wallet with trembling fingers. He fumbled with the bills, dropping a few onto the floor in his haste. When he bent down to pick them up, his face burned red, not just from embarrassment, but from the sheer magnitude of what he had done. Across the room, the elderly man at the counter leaned over to his wife, shaking his head slowly. "Can you believe that? Those two strutted in here like they owned the place, and now—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the men who were still struggling to compose themselves. His wife patted his arm sympathetically. "It's a lesson for all of us," she said softly. "You never know who you're talking to or what they've been through." At another table, a young woman who had been quietly observing the entire exchange pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she debated whether to share the story online. Part of her wanted to tell the world about the humble Supreme Court judge who had shut down two bullies without raising her voice. But another part of her hesitated, wondering if doing so would somehow diminish the dignity of the moment. In the end, she decided against it, tucking her phone back into her pocket with a thoughtful sigh. Meanwhile, the two businessmen finally managed to gather their belongings and shuffle toward the exit. Their steps were slow and heavy, weighed down not just by guilt but by the knowledge that everyone in the diner was watching them leave. As they pushed open the door, a wave of relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. Outside, the bright sunlight felt almost accusatory, highlighting their every misstep. They climbed into their car in silence, neither man daring to break the tension. After several minutes, one of them finally spoke, his voice hoarse and strained. "What do we do now?" he asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His friend slumped in the passenger seat, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we owe her an apology, a real one." The driver nodded grimly, starting the engine. They drove, away from the diner, their minds racing with thoughts of redemption. How does one apologize to a Supreme Court judge? Would she even accept it? Or had they burned that bridge forever? Justice Carter, meanwhile, had already put the incident behind her. She slid into her modest sedan, adjusting the rearview mirror as she fastened her seatbelt. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, composed, unshaken. She allowed herself a small smile, not out of satisfaction but out of gratitude. Gratitude for the reminder that even in moments of adversity, grace and patience could prevail. As she navigated the streets, her thoughts drifted to the lessons embedded in the day's events. People often judged others based on appearances, seeking validation for their own insecurities. Yet true character wasn't defined by titles or outward displays of success. It was revealed in how one treated others, especially when no one was watching. Justice Carter had chosen not to retaliate or humiliate the two men further. Instead, she had offered them a chance to grow, to reflect, and perhaps to become better versions of themselves. Her phone buzzed gently in the cup holder, pulling her from her musings. It was a text from her assistant, reminding her of an upcoming meeting at the courthouse. She glanced at the message briefly before setting it aside. Work awaited her as it always did, but for now she took a deep breath and savored the quiet drive home. Hours later, the diner began to empty as customers finished their meals and resumed their daily routines. The staff cleaned up the tables, stacking plates and wiping down surfaces. Yet the memory of Justice Carter lingered in the air, woven into the fabric of the space like an invisible thread. The waitress recounted the story to a coworker during their break, her eyes lighting up as she described the moment the badge came out. "She didn't yell or get mad," the waitress said, shaking her head in admiration. "She just handled it like it was nothing." Her coworker nodded thoughtfully. "That's the kind of person you want running the country, you know? Someone who stays calm under pressure and doesn't let ego get in the way." By the time night fell, the diner returned to its usual rhythm. The clink of dishes and murmur of conversation filled the space once more, masking the echoes of the day's drama. But for many who had witnessed it, the encounter with Justice Evelyn Carter would remain etched in their memories, a powerful reminder of humility, respect, and the unexpected ways life could teach its most valuable lessons. The following morning, the small diner buzzed with a new kind of energy. News of the previous day's encounter had spread like wildfire through the town, carried by word of mouth and fueled by curiosity. Customers trickled in earlier than usual, eager to catch a glimpse of the place where an unassuming Supreme Court judge had turned the tables on two arrogant businessmen. The staff, too, found themselves fielding questions from patrons who wanted every detail of the story. Did she really just sit there while they insulted her? One customer asked the waitress, leaning forward conspiratorially. "She didn't say a word until the very end," the waitress replied, her voice tinged with admiration. "And when she did speak, it was like, I don't know, like everything stopped. You could feel how much power she had even though she wasn't trying to show it." The diner became something of a local landmark overnight, its quiet charm now imbued with a sense of intrigue. People snapped photos of the table where Justice Carter had sat as if capturing a piece of history. Others whispered theories about why she might have chosen such a humble spot for her lunch break. Some speculated that she came here often, enjoying the anonymity of being far from the spotlight. Others believed it was a rare moment, a fleeting escape from the demands of her high-profile career. Amidst all the excitement, however, the two businessmen remained conspicuously absent. Word around town was that they had spent the night grappling with their guilt, unable to shake the image of Justice Carter's calm but piercing gaze. They replayed the scene over and over in their minds, each recollection more painful than the last. One of them paced his living room, muttering apologies under his breath, while the other stared blankly at his laptop screen, unable to focus on anything else. By mid-morning, they finally mustered the courage to act. After a long discussion filled with self-recrimination and second-guessing, they decided to write a letter, a formal apology addressed to Justice Evelyn Carter. They poured their regret onto the page, carefully choosing their words to convey both remorse and humility. "We deeply regret our behavior yesterday," the letter began. "Our comments were disrespectful, cruel, and entirely unwarranted. We failed to treat you with the dignity and respect you deserve, not only as a person, but also as someone who holds such an esteemed position. Please know that we are truly sorry for any harm we caused." They signed it simply. Two men who learned a valuable lesson. It wasn't perfect, but it was heartfelt, a genuine attempt to make amends. They debated sending it anonymously, but ultimately decided against it. If they were going to apologize, they needed to own their actions fully. After sealing the envelope, they drove to the courthouse, hoping to deliver the letter personally. When they arrived, they were struck by the grandeur of the building, a stark contrast to the modest diner they had visited the day before. Its towering columns and stately facade seemed almost intimidating, a physical representation of the justice system itself. As they approached the entrance, they hesitated, suddenly aware of how insignificant they felt in this space. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed and reverent. Clerks bustled quietly between offices, and lawyers whispered strategy notes to their clients. The two men approached the reception desk, clutching the envelope tightly. "We'd like to leave this for Justice Carter," one of them said nervously, sliding the letter across the counter. The clerk raised an eyebrow but nodded, accepting the envelope without comment. Unbeknownst to them, Justice Carter received the letter later that afternoon. She opened it during a brief pause in her schedule, her expression unreadable as she read their words. When she finished, she set the letter aside thoughtfully, folding her hands atop her desk. There was no anger in her eyes, no lingering resentment, only a quiet acknowledgement that people were capable of growth, even after making mistakes. Meanwhile, back in the town, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such an extraordinary event. The diner continued to draw curious visitors, though the frenzy eventually subsided. Regulars joked about renaming the establishment Justice Diner, while others suggested hanging a plaque commemorating the incident. The owner, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, chuckled at these ideas but ultimately declined. "It's just a diner," he said with a shrug. "But yeah, it'll always be special to us." For the staff, especially the waitress who had witnessed the entire exchange, the memory of Justice Carter served as a source of inspiration. Over coffee breaks, they discussed the lessons they had taken away from the experience. "She taught me that kindness isn't weakness," the waitress confided to a coworker one evening. "You can stand up for yourself without tearing someone else down." Even those who hadn't been present that day felt the ripple effects. Parents used the story to teach their children about humility and treating others with respect, regardless of appearances. Teachers incorporated it into classroom discussions about empathy and prejudice. In a way, Justice Carter's brief visit had sparked a quiet revolution, a collective effort to reflect on personal biases and strive for better interactions with the world. As days turned into weeks, the two businessmen worked hard to rebuild their reputations, not just in the eyes of others but within themselves. They began volunteering at community organizations, seeking opportunities to give back and prove that they were committed to change. One of them started mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing the lessons he had learned about integrity and accountability. The other focused on improving workplace dynamics at his company, advocating for policies that fostered mutual respect among employees. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues remarked on their newfound humility, and friends noted how much more grounded they seemed. While the sting of embarrassment would likely linger for some time, they embraced it as a reminder of the importance of treating everyone with dignity. In the months that followed, rumors circulated that Justice Carter occasionally returned to the diner, always sitting at the same table near the corner. Whether or not these sightings were true remained uncertain, but the possibility kept hope alive for those who admired her grace under pressure. To them, she represented more than just a powerful figure. She embodied the idea that true strength lies not in dominance but in compassion. And so the legacy of that fateful afternoon endured, not through fanfare or spectacle, but through the quiet impact it left on the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed it. For the townspeople, the diner staff, and even the two chastened businessmen, it was a story they would carry with them forever, a testament to the enduring power of humility, respect, and redemption. Months passed, and life in the small town settled into its usual rhythm once again. The diner returned to its cozy, unassuming self, though occasional visitors still stopped by hoping to catch a glimpse of Justice Evelyn Carter or hear first-hand accounts of the now famous incident. The staff grew accustomed to sharing the story with curious patrons, their retellings becoming polished over time like a well-loved tale. Yet, despite the passage of weeks and seasons, the memory of that day lingered, not as gossip, but as a quiet reminder of the lessons it had imparted. For the two businessmen, the journey toward redemption became a cornerstone of their lives. Their initial shame evolved into something more constructive, a determination to live differently. One of them began attending local community meetings, listening intently to concerns raised by residents and offering his expertise where needed. At first, people eyed him skeptically, unsure whether he was genuine or simply trying to repair his image. But as months went by, his consistent presence and willingness to help earned him a measure of trust. Slowly, he found himself welcomed back into spaces he had once taken for granted. The other businessman focused on transforming his workplace culture. He implemented training sessions on empathy and respect, encouraging open dialogue among employees about how they treated one another. These initiatives were met with mixed reactions at first. Some dismissed them as unnecessary, while others embraced the opportunity for growth. Over time, however, the changes began to take root. Coworkers started holding each other accountable, fostering an environment where kindness wasn't seen as weakness but as strength. Their transformation didn't go unnoticed. Friends and colleagues who had witnessed their earlier arrogance marveled at the shift. "It's like they're different people," one coworker remarked during a casual lunch conversation. Another nodded in agreement, adding, "They've really turned things around. I think they learned their lesson." Despite their progress, the two men never forgot the weight of Justice Carter's words. They often reflected on her calm demeanor and the way she had handled their insults, not with anger or retaliation, but with grace and wisdom. Her response had been a masterclass in poise, and they carried it with them as a guiding principle. Whenever they felt tempted to fall back into old patterns, they reminded themselves of the power of humility and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Justice Carter, for her part, remained largely unaware of the ripple effects her actions had created. She continued her work at the Supreme Court, balancing the demands of her position with moments of quiet reflection. Occasionally, she would return to the diner, drawn by its simplicity and the sense of peace it offered. Each visit was unannounced and brief, yet every time she walked through the door she noticed subtle nods of recognition from the staff and regulars. No one approached her directly. There was an unspoken understanding that she valued her privacy, but the warmth in their smiles spoke volumes. During one such visit, the waitress who had witnessed the confrontation approached her table hesitantly. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you." Justice Carter looked up from her coffee cup, her expression softening. "Thank you," she echoed gently, inviting the young woman to continue. "Yes," the waitress said, gathering courage. "You showed us all what real strength looks like, and, well, you inspired me to be better, to treat people better." She paused, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I hope that doesn't sound silly." Justice Carter smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up her face. "Not at all," she replied warmly. "If my actions helped even one person see the world a little differently, then I consider it time well spent." Her words lingered in the air long after she left the diner that day, leaving the waitress, and everyone else who heard the exchange, with a renewed sense of purpose as the years rolled on. The story of the humble judge and the arrogant businessman became something of a legend in the town. It was told and retold at family gatherings, school assemblies, and community events, each retelling imbued with fresh meaning depending on the listener's perspective. For some, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of judgment and arrogance. For others, it was a celebration of resilience and the capacity for change. And for many, it was both, a reminder that no one is beyond redemption and that even the smallest acts of grace can spark profound transformation. The diner itself underwent subtle changes over time. A new sign was added above the entrance reading, "A place where stories are made." Inside, a framed newspaper clipping about Justice Carter hung proudly on the wall, accompanied by a handwritten note from the owner, "To Justice Evelyn Carter, whose quiet strength reminded us all of what truly matters." The two businessmen eventually crossed paths with Justice Carter again, not in the courtroom or the diner, but at a charity gala held to support legal aid services for underserved communities. When they spotted her across the room, their hearts raced with a mix of apprehension and gratitude. Summoning their courage, they approached her, extending their hands in greeting. "Justice Carter," one of them began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "we just wanted to thank you for everything. Your forgiveness meant more to us than you'll ever know." The other nodded fervently, adding, "We've tried to honor the lesson you taught us. We hope we've done you proud." Justice Carter regarded them thoughtfully, her gaze warm yet piercing. After a moment, she extended her hand in return, shaking theirs firmly. "I'm glad to see you've grown," she said simply. "That's all any of us can hope for, to learn, to grow, and to do better." Her words resonated deeply, not only with the two men, but with everyone within earshot. As they parted ways, the businessmen felt a weight lift from their shoulders. A final, piece of closure to a chapter they had worked so hard to rewrite. They left the gala with lighter hearts, knowing they had been given a second chance and had made the most of it. In the end, the legacy of that fateful afternoon endured not because of its drama, but because of its humanity. It was a story about mistakes and forgiveness, about assumptions overturned and lessons learned. It reminded everyone involved and those who heard the tale that true greatness lies not in titles or accolades, but in the everyday choices we make. To listen, to empathize, and to treat others with kindness. And so, the memory of Justice Evelyn Carter and her quiet defiance lived on, not as a tale of vengeance or triumph, but as a testament to the enduring power of grace. In a world often divided by judgment and misunderstanding, her actions served as a beacon of hope, proving that even in the face of cruelty, compassion could prevail.